Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and earlier this week I had a live class with a bunch of students during which we discussed one of Aesop's fables, and we had a great discussion, went through the whole lesson, and at the end of the lesson I realized that I didn't press the record button, and so that class meeting and the discussion was lost. So rather than allow it to be completely lost, what I would like to do is record an explanation of this fable all over again so that the students can have a copy of it, and also while the discussion is still fresh in my mind. So I'm going to walk through Aesop's fable of the fox and the ape. The fox and the ape. In the Academy's Aesop's Fables course, this is lesson number 81. So lesson 81, the fox and the ape. So let's go ahead and take a look at the text, and we'll read it together and then talk about the details. So this is the fable of the fox and the ape. Upon the decease of the lion, the beasts of the forest assembled to choose another king. The ape played so many grimaces, gambols, and antic tricks that he was elected by a large majority, and the crown was placed upon his head. The fox, envious of this distinction, seeing soon after a trap baited with a piece of meat, approached the new king and said with mock humility, "May it please your majesty, I have found on your domain a treasure to which, if you will deign to accompany me, I will show you, or I will conduct you, The ape thereupon set off with the fox, and on arriving at the spot, laid his paw upon the meat. Snap went the trap and caught him by the fingers. Mad with the shame and the pain, he reproached the fox for a false thief and a traitor. Reynard laughed heartily, and going off, said over his shoulder with a sneer, "You, a king, and not understand a trap." This is Aesop's fable of the fox and the ape. So to establish the context of this fable, and remember what a fable is a fictitious story that is impossible, it cannot possibly be true, and it's intended to be explicitly not possible. That's why Aesop uses animals to tell these stories. In the same way that in algebra we use letters to represent quantities so that there's no confusion in getting the quantities confused with known numbers. We use letters. In the same way in philosophy, to present a moral lesson in a way that doesn't allow it to be confused with any historical or specific event, the fable writer will use ridiculous stories, impossible stories, which nevertheless teach a very important moral lesson. And the reason for that, again, is so that the moral lesson can be generalized and not linked to any historical details or historical persons, and can be applied to any person's life with a little bit of meditation and interest. So the fable here is about a group of animals living in a forest whose leader, the lion, has died. And for younger students, just to make sure you're careful with the vocabulary, notice that the word there in that opening phrase is decease, spelled with D-E-C, not disease, spelled D-I-S. So upon the decease of the lion, that means the death of the lion, the beasts of the forest assembled to choose another king. So we have not only a kingdom of animals, but we've got a democratic community of animals. They gather to choose their own king. So this is a democratic community out in the forest. The ape played so many grimaces, gambols, and antic tricks, in other words, acted like a monkey, that he was elected by a large majority, and the crown was placed upon his head. So here Aesop tells us that these animals operating with a democratic system of government chose to conduct an election, and the candidates presented their cases, and the large majority of the animals voted for the ape because he acted like an ape, which apparently they got a kick out of. So they enjoyed the message and performance of this ape, and a large majority of them chose him to be their new king. And as a result, the crown was placed upon his head. The fox, and remember, the fox in Aesop is always a cunning, shrewd character. The fox, envious of this distinction, and I took some time during the meeting to talk about this word envy because it's important to understand what envy is. Envy is when a man is angry at another person's success when that person deserves the success. So envy is a vice. Envy is when we're angry to see someone succeed when that person is worthy of the success that they enjoy. That's envy. To see a person who is not worthy receive some honor. Let's say a student cheats on a test and gets a good grade and wins an award. I have once had a student do this in one of my classes. He cheated on the National Latin exam. He was one of our worst students in the school, and he won an award from the National Latin exam, which was literally laughed at by the student body because everyone knew he wasn't a good student. But when we see someone who is unworthy receiving a reward, we either laugh at it, as in that case with the students, or we get angry. If it's something that actually affects us, let's say something that we worked for and desired, and we pursued the right way, and we see someone else obtain it who didn't do what was required and wasn't worthy of that honor, we tend to get angry. But that's not envy. That's often righteous anger and frustration. But envy is the vexation that one feels when a worthy person receives an honor or enjoys some prosperity. That's envy, and it's a vice. So the fox, envious of this distinction, seeing soon after a trap baited with a piece of meat, approached the new king. So the fox, he envies this situation. Envy here is actually not the right word. What he has is not really envy. He's just frustrated. Obviously, he desired this position, and based on his shrewdness and cunning, he believed that shrewdness should be the mark that distinguishes a ruler of a people. Being frustrated at the ape's victory, he decides to teach not only the ape, but also the other animals a lesson, to show that he was a more worthy candidate. He finds a trap in the woods that's baited with a piece of meat and decides to reveal this new king's lack of qualifications. So he goes to the so-called king and, speaking sarcastically, says, "May it please your majesty, I have found a treasure, and if you will deign to accompany me," the word deign means to will, "if you will accompany me, I will conduct you there." And so the ape sets off with the fox, and we can imagine the ape strutting around in his new crown, receiving this flattery from a subject, being called Your Majesty and so on, he struts off following this fox after this treasure which is found on his domain and is therefore his rightful possession. They finally get to the spot. This ape sees the meat there, reaches down to grab it, and snap, his hand is caught in a trap. So the fox shows how easily this ape can be duped. And then the ape, it says, mad with shame because he's embarrassed publicly in front of the other animals and also the pain of the trap itself. He reproaches the fox, calling him a false thief and traitor. Reynard, which we assume is the fox's name, laughs heartily and going off said over his shoulder with a sneer, "You a king and not understand a trap. How can you be a king if you don't understand a trap?" So the fox is pleased that he has shown his superiority and revealed the foolishness of electing an ape as a king who has no discernment. And that's, again, the fable of the fox and the ape. Now, we talked about this in our meeting, got into the details a little bit. And what's amazing about Aesop's fables is that the longer you think about them, the longer you talk about them, the more complex they get, the more profound they get. And you begin to realize that we can just keep going with this fable forever, and it's just going to get more and more interesting and more helpful. And that's what happened during our discussion. We started to realize that there's a lot here, and it led to some funny comments and things like that, but I'd like to just walk you through what we talked about. First of all, as I said before, it's obvious that Aesop is speaking here of a democratic community. He's talking about beasts of the forest getting together to choose a successor to their deceased king, the lion. So we've got a fable about democracy, democratic government. The message that Aesop gives us here, which is obviously a disapproval of democratic government, is that these foolish animals, they elect, a large majority of them, elect an ape who dances around on stage with a bunch of grimaces, gambols, and antic tricks, acting like a monkey, entertains and pleases the crowd, and they actually vote to make him king. And what we talked about in our meeting was that I asked the students, I said, do you think that in a community of people, that the majority of the people in that community would be wise or foolish? And the kids all immediately responded foolish. The majority will normally be foolish. Therefore, democracy, almost by necessity, is a form of government where the foolish rule the country or the state. And here we see this idea of the majority of the beasts, the irrational animals, the majority of them willing to choose an ape based on his ape-like behavior. No consideration for the responsibilities of such a ruler, no concern for potential dangers that the ruler will be expected to help them to avoid or get out of. They simply vote for the guy who plays around and does things that they like. This is the kind of vote to be expected from the majority in a democratic society. The fox represents, let's say, another candidate, a candidate who actually possesses the cunning or the craftiness that's really necessary for government, and yet he doesn't have the favor and vote of the majority of the people. So the fox, who has this shrewdness which is much more valuable for the safeguarding of a people, for keeping them safe, the people aren't interested in such a person, just like children aren't interested in listening to their parents, but they'll listen to some, weird character in a movie or on the internet, on a video. Well, the fox is frustrated by this, and he decides to reveal the foolishness of this democratic government. And so he leads their king right into a trap and has the king injured in a humiliating way in the presence of his constituents, as it were, or the people who voted for him. So the fox wants to show how foolish the voters were for not choosing him, and he does so by leading their king into a trap and getting his fingers snapped up by this trap in the woods. And then the fox concludes with, how can you be a king when you can't even discern the presence of a trap? So as we looked at this fable, and we can see it's obviously a joking or a play on democracy and how foolish democratic government is. And we talked about that a bit, and how governments can, how politicians simply have to play the ape, and they can impress the majority, and the majority have the power to put them in office. And of course the kids were ready to name specific politicians and things like that, but I told them that's really not for us to get into. Let's just focus on the moral lesson. The ape was able to please the people, and Aesop obviously is telling us this to disapprove of democratic government. And so we can talk about that and say, well, that's the danger. People can appeal to the majority and just do whatever it takes to please them. This is the idea in ancient government of bread and circuses, where rulers would simply keep the people entertained, by giving them food and putting on all kinds of extravagant games and events and activities in the society so that people don't pay attention to government issues. And as long as you give them their bread and circuses, put on your little ape show for the people, they'll vote for you to be their president. One of the first memories I have of politics growing up as a kid, this was when I was in high school. I remember Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on MTV. And you just think about that and you say, what in the world does playing a saxophone on MTV have to do with running for the presidency? And this fable tells us exactly what it has to do. And I can remember being a young teenager thinking, wow, that's pretty cool. This guy who's running for president can play the saxophone, and he's on MTV. MTV, in case you don't know, was a television channel that just played music videos and stuff all the time. So it was very popular when I was a kid. It was where all the newest songs were revealed, and you could see the performers and the bands and stuff like that. But anyway, to have a presidential candidate playing a saxophone wearing sunglasses on MTV was cool, because the ape was playing his act to please the majority, and of course he won the election. So I remember that as a kid, and obviously Aesop is showing us the foolishness of having the common people vote where the majority can simply be led by some ape to vote for him. And he seems to be suggesting that this puts the state in danger. And the fox, being the shrewd one, who doesn't have the support or interest of the majority, he's left frustrated by the result. And what does he do? He turns to humiliating the elected leader. And this is what many turn to in our society today. How many Christians, how many conservatives have you seen posting videos and mocking the President Joe Biden for things that he may say incorrectly, or embarrassing events at his speeches and things like that? The man is in his 80s and obviously makes makes errors because he's losing his mind from old age. How often have you seen him made fun of by the conservatives that he beat for that office? And so, in a similar way, we see the fox here, who's the loser, deciding that what he's going to do is simply humiliate the candidate who won the election. And he leads the ape, the king, into this trap, humiliates him. The king is ashamed in front of all the people. And what does the fox do? He walks off, laughing to himself, scoffing at the king. And so what I talked about with the kids is, what does the fox really accomplish here? The fox is the loser. The outcome of the election is not what he had hoped for, and it's a significant election. He would have hoped to be elected, or he would have hoped that someone who was clever or cunning would be elected, but he lost. So the fox may think that he's cunning, and this is, I think, one of the interesting things. Again, as you think about these fables more and more, the details sort of, flower and become more and more complex and interesting. The fox considers himself to be shrewd, considers himself to be able to escape the traps. But why didn't the fox figure out how to escape the trap of the election itself? He's making fun of an ape for acting like a clown to win an election, when in fact, considering how an election works, the ape was actually the more cunning of the two. The ape figured out what the people wanted and what would lead him to victory, and he went out there and did it and won the election. The fox, thinking he was so clever, probably talked about serious stuff and warned about the silliness of the ape and so on. The majority probably found him boring and ridiculous, and so they chose to vote for the ape, while the fox, who styles himself to be cunning and smart, he lost the election. So who's really the smart one, the ape or the fox? The fox thinks that he's so clever now he can go and get this ape's hand caught in a trap. But what's the fox actually proving? He lost the election. He has no control of the government, and he's living in a state that's being ruled by foolish people. How is he actually cunning or clever? He may be personally cunning, but politically he's not cunning. Politically, the ape is the more cunning one of the two, because he's able to win the election. And so there's a lot in this that I think you can get into, and I think there's a very good application, which I'll talk about in a minute. So anyway, the fox, everyone who reads this will assume the fox was clever, the ape was dumb, but in fact, the challenge here, the goal, the contest was to win an election, and the fox failed, and the ape succeeded. So who's really more clever? And the fox, like I said, chooses to humiliate his opponent after losing to him in a vain and silly kind of way that's irrelevant. Just as many in modern society make fun of and try to humiliate the political candidate who actually won the elections. So you see, there's a lot to think about in this, and that leads us to talk about the application of it. And what I talked about with the kids was this. I said, you may think that you're cunning and sly like a fox, but if there's a contest, if there's a significant event, and you are competing for victory in this event, and you think you're so smart and you're so clever, but you lose, how clever and smart are you really? And many Christians, many conservatives, politically, act like the fox in this fable. They boast about their cunning, they boast about how smart they are, they boast about how discerning they are, and yet they lose the contest. So who's really more discerning? They criticize their opponents politically. They talk about how dumb they are, how foolish they are, how ignorant they are, how clueless they are. They mock them and scoff at them, pass around videos of their mistakes and try to humiliate them. But what they seem to miss is the fact that as far as the elections are concerned, their opponents are beating them. And they're not as clever as they think they are. And it would be good for us to realize that we often act like this fox. And while we lose this and lose that and give up this and retreat from that, we walk away like the fox, telling ourselves that we're so smart and clever, when in fact we're losing everything to these opponents whom we're laughing at and trying to humiliate, while they win and take over these things. So I think a good moral lesson from this fable is, to quote St. Paul, he says, "If any man thinks he stands, let him take heed lest he fall." If any man thinks he stands, let him take heed lest he fall. In other words, be careful when you think that you really have it all together, because that pride, that arrogance may actually cause you to be defeated. And that's, I would argue, what happens to conservatives in modern politics. Excuse me. I believe they've got this opinion of themselves that they're so clever and so smart and they have all the right answers, that they don't pay attention to the actual contest at hand. And rather than finding a way to compromise and overcome the faults of democratic government and actually compete for an election and win an election, they choose to strut around boasting of their cleverness, and their opponents get elected into office. And so we have this experience of the fox here, true of the conservative politicians. And I'm not picking on conservatives, because when a conservative wins an election, the liberals, or usually it's Republican and Democrats in America, the Democrats, when they lose to a Republican, they mock and humiliate the Republican and say how dumb he is and how ignorant he is and ridiculous, and as if they don't realize that he just beat them in the election, which was the actual goal. So we see this on both sides. I'm not picking on one side or the other. We see this in politics. One side imagining itself to be superior and yet losing the election, and then thinking to mock and humiliate the victor, rather than learn from it and realize that their approach is not effective. And while they may be smart in many things, they're not smart in the thing that matters the most, which is actually winning the election. And so it teaches us that we've got to be more cunning. We've got to be more cunning in things that we do. We've got to be more shrewd, because if you don't win the election, it doesn't matter how clever your policies are, because you're not going to be able to implement them in office anyway. So it teaches us that there's two different things. There's a cleverness or a shrewdness that can win the election, and then there's another cleverness or shrewdness that can actually take advantage of the power that's gained through that election and use that power to do one's will. So we have a good political lesson, I think, from this fable of the fox and the ape, and that's still pretty literal. We're sticking more or less to the story. We can think more abstractly about it and think how it would apply in other areas, like in business, for example, where a business owner can mock his opponents while they beat them and win customers by doing something that the other business owner thinks is silly, but in fact it's effective. And the business owner who's losing business and losing the competition can walk around boasting about how he would never do that and he thinks he's so smart. But that's how the business works. That's what moves the market, and ultimately that's what business is about. So there are a number of good lessons here, and what I encourage the students to do all the time is to look at the story, look at the fable through the eyes of different characters, and as you do that, you'll notice different moral lessons. If we look through the perspective of the ape, we'll see that it's easy to have your way with the majority by simply playing to their interests. And so we can see the ape as successful, and we can see that the ape needs to be careful for envious opponents or jealous opponents who seek to mislead him and humiliate him. So it teaches us to be careful. Like when the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus. Remember, Jesus actually called Herod a fox in the gospel. He said, "Go and tell that fox." I believe it was Jesus. For some reason, I think it might have been John the Baptist, but I think that was Jesus who said that. He says, "Go and tell that fox." So we see here a need to watch out for envious enemies who may try to humiliate us and lead us into trouble because they're envy and frustrated by our success. So that could be a moral lesson we learn by looking at the story from the perspective of the ape. If we look at it from the perspective of the fox, we see that if you are in fact clever, if you do have the answers, well, that's all useless if you can't win the election. So you've got to learn to do both. You've got to learn to win the election, and you've got to also be shrewd enough to govern the state once elected. In business, we can say, and a lot of Christians do this, they'll say, well, I really like this kind of work or that kind of work, but I hate making money. I hate doing business. I don't like advertising. I don't like asking people for money and things like that. Well, that's like being the fox. Like, so you've got this great, you imagine that you've got this great product or service, but you don't like doing business. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you have to do business. Otherwise, your great product is useless. So you've got to do both. You've got to understand how to do the business side of things, and by doing the business side of things, then you get the opportunity to do the things that you're really interested in, which again, many Christians struggle in this because they would like, let's say they would like to be a teacher, but they don't want to go through the training and the qualifications that are necessary to become a teacher. And so they say, that's those dumb modern schools, all they care about is a teaching certificate. They don't even care if you're a good teacher. They just look to see if you have a certificate. And then they talk about how good a teacher they are and how smart they are. Well, if you're so smart, why didn't you just get the certificate? Because you're like this fox, that's why. If you're so clever as a businessman, why don't you just get the business work done and do both? Well, because you're like the fox. You think that you're clever, but what you do doesn't make much sense. And in the end, it's useless. You've got to do both. You've got to be able to do the things you don't like because they're necessary so that you can get yourself into a position where you have the opportunity to do the things that you do like, that you think are important. And if you're not willing to do the hard part, the first part that's unpleasant, well, then you don't deserve to enjoy the second part, and you're not going to have it. And this is the lesson that the fox useless mocking reveals for us. And I think most people who read this fable will think that the ape is dumb and the fox is smart, and ha ha ha, look at the ape, how he got caught in the trap. But I don't think that that's a necessary interpretation of this fable. I think this fable teaches us the vanity of mocking your opponents when your opponents beat you at the contests. And you mock and humiliate them in things that are useless and just spiteful, but don't affect the situation at all. Another example of this is if you play sports. In a sports contest, any kind of game, there's a scoreboard, there's a contest. They keep score, and so on. And the team that has the most points at the end of the game wins the game. And so often when you're playing sports, there will be players who what we call talk trash. They talk all kinds of talk. They make fun of you if you miss a shot or you make a bad pass or miss a ball. They may laugh and cheer and razz you and things like that. and they may be talking the whole time, but then at the end of the game, you look up at the scoreboard and your team wins, and they're still talking trash as if they're better. Well, if you're better, then you should have scored more points. And that's the kind of spirit, I think, that we see here in the fox, right? The scoreboard tells us who won, not your opinion of yourself. Because if you think you're really impressive and you think you're great, but you don't score more points, well, you're not better, no matter what you think of yourself. If you think you're so smart, but you lose the election, it really doesn't matter how smart you are, because what matters first is that you win the election. And so I think that this teaches us the vanity of this kind of arrogant, envious, spiteful mockery of those who actually do things successfully, like the ape. Sure, it's a criticism of democracy. It shows us how dumb the whole thing is. But it also shows us that you have no excuse if you say that, impressing the common people is necessary to win an election, and you say, oh, well, that's just, anybody can do that. Well, then why don't you do it? Why don't you do it? If it's so easy, why don't you just do that? So it takes away that kind of excuse-making and leaves us wondering why we think we're so smart if we don't do the stuff that we say is easy. Why not do both? So that, I think, is the moral lesson of the fox and the ape. But as you continue to reflect on it and dig into it, you'll find it just gets deeper and deeper and more profound. So I encourage you to do that. And also remember that as you look at this from the different perspectives of the different characters, you'll see different insights into the fable and have lessons that you can draw from it and apply. And again, if we want to make a specific application, as the kids need to in these assignments, a specific application for the fox and the ape would be don't be overconfident in yourself, but make sure that you submit to the ways that things work. Make sure that you're willing to do what's necessary to actually be successful, and don't think that boasting of your own intelligence or cleverness when you fail to achieve the goal is in fact some kind of real intelligence. But understand how things work and work so as to win, like St. Paul says. Run so as to win, and to win you have to play by the rules. And so rather than think and pat yourself on the back and praise yourself, realize that if you lose, you're not as smart and clever as you think you are, and you need to learn how to win. And if you learn how to win, then your intelligence, your cleverness can actually benefit people, and you can actually do good. So you've got to run so as to win, and you've got to run according to the rules, like St. Paul says. So that's all for the fable of the fox and the ape. I think our class discussion was a little better than this discussion was, but it's a very interesting fable, profound fable that, especially for us living in America today, has some important applications and teaches us a good lesson that I think will humble us and make us give up on this uselessness of mocking our victorious opponents when we lose political contests. If we're really so smart, why don't we win? I hope that's helpful. God bless.